Hello, my beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Project Work in Progress. And I apologize for taking so long for another episode to come out. It's been kind of busy for the past few weeks, and I finally got the time to put the second episode together. So, the second episode, I want to touch on the topic of craftsmanship. It is another topic that I kind of only started thinking after graduation. And once I had more time, I was kind of stuck on my work process a little bit. And therefore, I started the whole thinking about what is craftsmanship and how do I kind of view it and how I want to use it on my project. So, as usual, I'd like to start with a little story. So, this was back before I even went to college. And my mom had a bar at the time, and she has these really tall bar stools that needs to be kind of not needs to be, but like she wants them to be decorated. And I was just kind of like doing the free labors. And on the day that I was painting the stools, there is this guy. He's like the son of a family friend of my mom. Um, and he studied transportation photography at the time. So he knows much more about designs than I was. And I remember when I was painting those stools, I painted this little bird on one of the uh, wood tops. And this guy came to me and he's like, being an artist or being a designer is all about craftsmanship. And um, so he challenged me to paint the bird as sleek as I could. I don't even know is that a thing, but um, that's just kind of like a challenge that he proposed to me, and I definitely accepted it, because I was all up on the passion about art and design. This guy is like much more knowledgeable than me, at least how I understood it. So I painted that bird to the very last detail. And I remember hitting the highlight on all the feathers. And at the end, I was looking at that bird. I was like, damn, this is the ugliest bird I've ever drawn in my whole life. Although it was the neatest bird I've ever drawn, though. It was an interesting experience because at that point I was like, I don't know about this craftsmanship um, theology. Yeah, it's like I don't really know how I agree with it because it takes the life out of something so quickly. And yeah, that was kind of like my first impression in terms of a direct application of the idea of craftsmanship, I guess. And from that point on, I pretty much just hold on to that idea for the rest of my college years because to me and from that experiment, it kind of occurred to me that craftsmanship is something that is extremely rigid, and once you care too much about the details, you care too much about how each highlight is reflected on a fucking feather, and it really takes out all the fun in something. And I really hold on to that idea for all of the years that I was in college, and I applied it to most of my projects. Well, first of all, I think I benefited a lot from that idea. And I did a lot of experimental, whether it's style or topics. I think I enjoyed the process when I was trying to, keep myself away from the typical craftsmanship mentality until when graduation times approaches, and especially I think a little bit after when I graduated, when I hit the art block, I was really stuck on the exploring stage in all of my projects. And it really held me back because my most of my things are kind of bound to one dimension, and I couldn't really go out of that or like push my projects to go further than just the ideation stage. And so after that realization, I kind of made myself go back and rethink about my understanding of craftsmanship because honestly, I really just gave it one chance, right? And I kind of took that one experience and ran with it for 6, 7 years, which is fine. I think I learned a lot from being in that mentality. But I think to a certain point, I think there is definitely a lot more room to grow and to improve. And so, first, I try to rethink on how I understood what craftsmanship is. When I think of craftsmanship, I think of technique, skill, how far you can push something on a certain project or subject into the stage that is as close to perfection as possible. Well, I don't really like the idea of something being perfect. I think it's really situational for something to be in perfection. Like for example, you might have this like extremely sleek idea or extremely cool design, but it might not necessarily fit in uh, an IP that is requires more simple style, or maybe the budget that is going to this type of design is extremely limited or limited enough that you couldn't execute the full scope of something. Um, and I think in those situations, if you create something that is not fitting to its environment, it really can you really say it's a perfect design? I think the idea of perfection is really limited in its situations, which is why this whole time I want to explore more outside of the idea of perfection. And maybe that's something not 100% executed in the way you expected in certain fields or certain level, but I think these projects can serve as just what's exploring out there, and it's impossible for something really new or something um, experimental to be so perfect. And another reason why I try to kind of pull myself away from the idea of achieving perfection is I came from a culture that really praises technical skills. So a lot of the education systems back in my country really focuses on how well you can do something. You know, for example, if you're painting an illustration, then how well or how down to the detail you can paint this image so that it looks as realistic as possible or it looks as well executed as possible. And under this type of education, a lot of the meanings underneath or the oh, there's the little guy. And during this kind of education systems, a lot of the core ideas or the soul of a project is really left out because you put all your energy and assets into making something looks uh, perfect. When you see someone that came out of this type of education system, there is a lot of skill and a lot of beautiful visuals involved, but it really lacks something within the art itself or within the design itself. And when I see that, it's really something that I like to stay away from because I think the core of a design or the soul of a story or the meaning behind something is extremely important. So here is an example of work that I think really represents how I understand the idea of craftsmanship, which is the anime called Akira. I'm sure everybody knows that, and it's like God's work, right? The reason why I love the design in Akira so much is because it has so much depth in its design, and it has so much history and existing design philosophies that inspires the creation of Akira. And I have made a little like story bundle that kind of explains the influence in character design in Akira. So the influence behind Kaneda's gang in Akira is the Bosozoku motorcycle gang in Japan after World War II. And these are a group of young kids that participated in World War II. Many of them are survivors of the kamikaze pilots. After war, they couldn't really adapt to the fast evolving of the Japanese society at the time. And so they formed this gang and tried to find the meaning of life within the motorcycle gang. And therefore, in Akira's design, you can see the influence of the bomber jacket. You can see the influence of the flight goggles. They are designs that are there not because they look cool, but because they have that layer of history in them. Which is why I think those designs are so iconic, because it contains history in them. So as I'm editing, I came across this video by Dami Lee about the architectures in Akira and how Otomo took inspirations from Kenzo Tange's master plan of metabolism, which was a modernism architecture movement post-war. I highly recommend watching this video as she talks much more in details about the background of this architecture movement and the history about it in relations to Akira. And me mentioning all of these settings of the world building of Akira is exactly what I'm trying to say about creating something that is not just for the sake of cool looking and beautiful colors, although those are part of what makes Akira so great in the first place. But I think it is the realistic portrayal of how the characters interact with their rapidly changing environment that makes it so special. And this level of realism cannot just come out of thin air. I think it is so much about how Otomo, the designer, really deeply researched, deeply understood, and deeply connected to his environment that led him to create such designs that has never been seen before, never been seen, but was anchored by depth of reality, depth of history. And so that was just something I really wanted to bring up as I was editing and going back to the actual video. And I've seen people today tries to replicate either the look of Akira or even some other artists, such as Miyazaki. A lot of commercial projects or artists that tries to capture the essence of these masters' work by replicating the visuals of it. You know, try to create the coolest next Akira bike, or try to create an animation that is like Miyazaki's work, but it really lacks the spirit in Miyazaki's films. The substance behind these projects are still missing. And I think this is why I want to bring up this example, because technical skills is really important part in creating really great work. But I think the meaning and the spirit behind these projects or these designs are what makes it stand out. And I think when you really have history and soul behind a project, it becomes evolvable. Let's say if you have this super cool design that is executed to the 1000%, right? But it lacks the soul behind it, it reaches the end of its creation. Because people who sees this project couldn't really grasp what's behind it, they can only admire what it is already. And so I think something that is executed to the absolute depth of technical skill but lack meaning behind it is really the end of a project, because there is nothing to evolve from, there's nothing to grow out of it. And I think true craftsmanship in a design really needs this level of depth in order for it to survive the test of time. And I think to that point is not necessarily surviving the test of time, but it's evolving with time. It's people can grasp what's behind it and just capture the intention of something and kind of do their own versions, or this thing can like evolve by itself over time. So I think it really isn't trying to like stand the test of time, but it's like, living with time, if that makes sense. And all of this is not saying that technical execution is not important in a project. If anything, I think that's the thing I'm lacking in my work process is I put a lot of focus on the meaning behind something, but I really overlooked the importance of technical skill, which is why this topic led itself to me after graduation. I think I took kind of like a backward route in the understanding of it. During this time, when I was trying to do the research on the topic of craftsmanship, there's a few things that I ran into that are really interesting. They are different representation of like technical craftsmanship that I mentioned that I kind of neglected in the past few years of my career. So during the research of craftsmanship in different cultures, one of them is the Japanese no masks. These masks are worn in a type of traditional Japanese operas, and there are craftsmen that are specifically trained to replicate the very, very first mask that was ever created for a specific opera. And I thought this was interesting because over time, this demand of technicality in how well you can replicate uh, the original mask, like some of it is like you gotta replicate to down to the details of maybe a small damage or like a tiny crack. You still gotta replicate those. And during this type of practice of craftsmanship, a lot of the traditions and histories are kind of preserved through this process. It's not necessarily about the individuality of artists anymore, it's more of contributing to something that is bigger. And another example of this is the art of Tanka in Tibetan Buddhism culture. So, quick apology here. I actually mistaken the Tanka with sand mandala. So, in the following part, what I actually want to say is the sand mandala of the Tibetan Buddhism. Tanka is actually another type of Buddhism painting. But yeah, I said it all of the times. So instead of Tanka, just replace it with sand mandala. The cool thing about it is it's so like the original Tanka is drawn with colorful sand, and these monks has to go to the mountains and create and like collect all these different minerals, rocks, or flowers and plants that makes the dye for the sand, and then they have to dye the sand. It's basically like this huge preparation for like a ceremonial art. And on the day of creating the Tanka art, they spend hours and hours. It takes multiple people to do a single piece of tanka. But at the end of the ceremony, they just blown it away. They just like sweep it off. But the process of this is the representation of the craftsmanship that I was researching for. For this particular example, I think it was really interesting that how much the process is being valued compared to the end result, because the end result is of course it's magnificent, but at the end is like people just sweep it off, right? And that is the main philosophy for the creation of tanka as well, is that it is non-preservative, it is temporal, but the craftsmanship lives within the process. Hi, this is our co-host. Which is why I think like this is another example that represents the idea of craftsmanship, but then it in juxta to the non-masks, instead of preserving, it really ceases to exist after the creation process is done. So another artist that I want to bring up in a more contemporary sense is Alexander McQueen. Now, he's not my absolute favorite artist in terms of like visuals. I think when it comes to fashion, designers like John Galliano or collections in Mason Margiela actually are what I respond to a little bit more in terms of visuals and theme. But I want to bring up Alexander McQueen because of his technical skills and his relevancy to the topic of craftsmanship. So, to have a specific example, in his 2010 Spring Summer runway show, Plato's Atlantis, he has a collection of garments that are inspired by sea creatures and reptilians. So, from what I've read, that his process of creating these garments is that he designs print patterns digitally, and during this step, he basically already has the structure of the garments in mind and printing them out, very specifically matching up the seams with the patterns, and eventually put together a garment that has very unique print as well as cutting patterns. So in this case, the print patterns affects the engineering of the garment, and at the same time, the structure of the garments emphasize the print patterns on the dresses. And eventually, all of these elements kind of come together and create this collection that not only has a very continuous theme, but also unique in every single piece of garment. And I think to have these type of freedom in his creations and how he executes them, it is really the thorough understanding of the garment, the creation of the garment itself, and also the body structure underneath that allows the construction of these garments be so harmonious. And this is what I want to emphasize on when I'm referencing him as an example of craftsman. So to kind of do a mini conclusion on this short research that I did on the topic of craftsmanship in different cultures, is that there are many, many different aspects to the idea of craftsmanship. And for us designers in more modern context, I think it's important to develop an eye to know where to apply which aspects of craftsmanship. And like I mentioned before in the topics of perfection, I don't think I like the idea of flawlessness. I think I prefer a holistic design than a perfect one, because I think I enjoy seeing something that invites you to be part of the creation of something. And it's like finding the right balance of perfection and, I guess, looseness in a project is the fun of creating something. If you like execute everything 100%, then there is like no room for imagination. There is no room for wondering. And so I think I've always loved the idea of being casually precise. It's this idea that you understand something so thoroughly that like you can pinpoint very specific feeling or a very specific message that you're trying to express. And with your skill set, you can achieve that point very casually or very loosely. And I think that's how I like to understand the idea of craftsmanship, is that you develop the eye to recognize what specific design to put where, or when to take out what when it's excessive. Something I'd like to add on is after I've done the research on how different culture executes in craftsmanship, is that it contradicts a little bit with the idea of spontaneity and creativity. I think it takes a lot for projects to be perfectly executed. I think everybody has felt this way at some point, is that when you do like a really quick sketch, it has a lot of expression, it has a lot of energy to it, but then when you bring it to a high fidelity execution, it kind of loses the energy of that sketch a little bit. It's really rare when like a final product to capture the essence of what's in a sketch. And that's, I think, the contradiction that I'm kind of still struggling with in terms of how I want to achieve craftsmanship but then capture the energy behind something as well. But I think this goes back to like developing an eye to recognize what work is most suitable in terms of its style or the medium or the level of finish. And I guess to finally, like, circling back to the subject of storytelling, I just really love the idea of having many, many layers that builds up to a final product, which is why I love world building so much, because it's kind of like the base level of one piece of design, creating the environment that allows a certain design or a certain story to exist. If you're to design something within the same world, they can be vastly different, but at the same time, they can have a lot of relations to each other as well. And that's what I appreciate a lot about Akira's design or Miyazaki's work. They're all extremely harmonious in terms of the world they live in, but also everything within this world has its own individualities. And I think this is craftsmanship in terms of storytelling and a design within world building. And the last thing that I want to bring up in the topic of craftsmanship is that I think being a capable designer is to recognize the purpose behind each medium and each style, to recognize those. When is to give many layers to a design, and when is to grasp a spark of inspiration. And knowing how and what it takes to achieve those different types of results. And I think in this case, the idea of perfection lives within the eye of the creator and the receiver. And so to conclude this huge video about craftsmanship, I think it is something much more than simply skill or the technical execution of something. And I think the joy lives within the process of finding those equilibrium for each single scenario within each single projects. And this brings to the end of this video. And thank you for listening if you stick to the end. I hope what I talked about in the video makes sense. Please let me know what you think. If you agree with what I said, if you have a different take on this topic, please leave it in the comments below. My cat says thank you as well. All right, cool. Have a good day and